Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There are names in the grim darkness of the far future that inspire fear. Others command respect, however grudging. Some are whispered in awe, spoken of in legends that span 10,000 years of endless war. And then there is a name that inspires something else entirely, something purer and more universal than any other emotion the Warhammer universe can evoke. That name is Erebus. Say it aloud, if you dare. Erebus. Feel how the syllables form in your mouth, how they carry the weight of a galaxy's worth of hatred. In the vast community of Warhammer fans, across countless forums and discussion boards, in games shops and painting tables around the world, this name provokes a reaction like no other. Not fear, not respect, pure, undiluted loathing. But who is this man, this word-bearer whose very existence seems designed to infuriate? What did he do to earn such universal contempt? The answer is simple, yet staggering in its implications. Erebus didn't just betray his brothers, though he did that. He didn't simply worship the dark gods, though he pioneered that path for his legion. No, what Erebus did was far more terrible, far more unforgivable. He broke the galaxy itself. Before Erebus, there was hope. The Imperium of man stood united under the Emperor, a golden age of reason and enlightenment spreading across the stars, like dawn breaking over an endless horizon. Humanity had emerged from the darkness of old night, from the terrors of the age of strife, and was reaching toward a future where mankind would rule the galaxy in peace and prosperity. The Great Crusade was reuniting lost human worlds, bringing them back into the fold, creating an empire that would stand eternal. Then came Erebus, one man with whispered words and patient schemes, one dark apostle who saw the shining edifice of the Imperium and decided to tear it down, not through brute force or open warfare, but through corruption and manipulation. He was the serpent in humanity's garden, and his poison spread through the mightiest warriors the galaxy had ever known. The Horus Heresy, the galaxy-spanning civil war that shattered the Imperium and condemned humanity to 10,000 years of stagnation and suffering. The war that killed countless billions, that turned brother against brother and son against father. The war that saw the Emperor himself struck down and imprisoned forever on the Golden Throne. Every death in that conflict, every world burned, every hope extinguished. And all of it can be traced back to one source, Erebus. But to understand why this man is so universally despised, we need to understand not just what he did, but how he did it. We need to follow his path from the beginning, from a nameless child on a backwater world to the architect of the greatest catastrophe in human history. We need to see him as he truly is, stripped of any tragic backstory or noble motivation. We need to see the monster wearing human skin. This isn't a tale of a hero fallen from grace. Erebus never fell, because he was never anything but what he is now. This isn't a story of corruption, because corruption implies there was something pure to begin with. No, this is the story of evil in its purest form, of malice given purpose, of a man who chose darkness not because he was forced to, not because he was broken or betrayed, but simply because that was what he wanted. In a universe filled with traitors and villains, with demon princes and Xenos horrors, with tyrants and madmen beyond counting, Erebus stands alone. He is the one character that the entire Warhammer community agrees upon. He is the one name that unites loyalist and traitor, imperial and chaos, in shared contempt. When fans say they hate Erebus, they mean it with a sincerity that transcends mere fiction. He is, without question or debate, the most hated character in all of Warhammer 40,000. So let us begin at the beginning, in the deserts of a world called Colchis, where a child was born who would one day unmake the galaxy. Let us trace the path of the Hand of Destiny, the architect of the heresy, the serpent who poisoned everything he touched. Or let us speak of Erebus, and understand why his name has become synonymous with betrayal itself. The boy from Colchis, origins in darkness. The world of Colchis burned under twin suns, its deserts stretching endlessly beneath skies that wavered with heat and dust. It was a hard world, unforgiving and brutal, where survival itself was a daily struggle. But it was also a world of faith, where religion permeated every aspect of life, where prayers were offered to distant powers that most imperial worlds had long forgotten. In a small village on this harsh world, a child was born to common parents. We don't know his original name, the name his mother gave him when she first held him in her arms. That name died long ago, strangled in the dust along with its owner. The boy who would become Erebus was, by all accounts, completely unremarkable in those early years. Just another child in another village on another backwater world. But even then, something was different. Even as a young boy, he felt it, a calling that had nothing to do with the faith his village practiced. Where other children played innocent games and learned their parents' trades, he found himself drawn to darker pastimes. He would capture scorpions from the desert, those lethal creatures whose sting could kill a grown man, and he would toy with them, not out of curiosity, not for any practical purpose. He did it because he enjoyed watching them suffer, because he felt a thrill in exerting his control over something dangerous. His parents scolded him, of course. They tried to correct his behavior, to mold him into something better. They would compare him to another boy in the village, as a studious and pious child who seemed to embody everything their son was not. This other boy was called Erebus, and he was everything parents could want in a child. He studied the religious texts with devotion. He helped his neighbors. He showed promise and dedication that marked him as someone special. The nameless boy heard these comparisons over and over. Be more like Erebus. Why can't you be as good as Erebus? Erebus would never behave this way. Each comparison was a knife. Each word of praise for another, a reminder of his own failures. And in the boy's mind, something dark took root and began to grow. Most children would have responded with jealousy, perhaps with increased effort to win their parents' approval. But this child was not like most children. He did not see Erebus as a rival to surpass or an example to follow. He saw him as an obstacle to be removed, a problem with a simple solution. One night, the boy took a length of garrote wire, thin and strong. He found Erebus alone, the perfect, studious, pious child who stood between him and his parents' approval. And he strangled him. It wasn't done in anger or passion. It was methodical, calculated, practical. When Erebus was dead, the boy studied his face, memorizing every detail. He looked at the religious tattoos that marked Erebus as a devoted follower of the faith, the intricate patterns that covered his skin. Then, with the same cold precision, he replicated those tattoos on his own flesh. He carved them into his skin, marking himself with the symbols of a faith he didn't believe in, wearing the identity of a boy he had just murdered. When he returned to his village, he wasn't the nameless troublemaker anymore. He was Erebus, the pious and studious child. And if people noticed that Erebus seemed different, colder, more calculating, they attributed it to growing up, to maturity. The original Erebus was never found. Perhaps his body was consumed by the desert, picked clean by scavengers, and buried by the shifting sands. Perhaps he simply disappeared from memory, another casualty of a harsh world where death was common enough that one missing boy wouldn't cause too much concern. What mattered was that the name Erebus now belonged to someone else, someone who would carry it to heights of infamy that the original bearer could never have imagined. Think about what this tells us. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. This was a calculated murder carried out by a child, as someone young enough that most would still possess innocence and empathy. He killed not because he was forced to, not to survive, but because it was convenient, because it solved a problem. And in doing so, he demonstrated the core truth of his nature, the fundamental reality that would define everything he would become. Erebus, even then, was capable of anything. He felt no remorse, no guilt, no hesitation. He saw what he wanted and he took it, regardless of the cost to others. And perhaps most terrifyingly, he enjoyed it. There was a thrill in the act itself, in the successful deception, in wearing another person's identity like a stolen coat. After taking the name Erebus, the boy left his village and made his way to one of Colchis' cities, to a place called Farthest. There, he presented himself as a devoted acolyte seeking to join the priesthood, to study the ancient ways and serve the faith. And why wouldn't they accept him? He had the tattoos, the mannerisms, the knowledge that the original Erebus had possessed. He played his part perfectly. At first, young Erebus went through the motions, learning what he needed to learn, saying what he needed to say, but gradually, something changed. As he studied the religious texts of Colchis, as he delved deeper into the mysteries of what they called the Old Faith, he began to see patterns. He began to understand that beneath the prayers and rituals, beneath the acceptable face of religion that Colchis showed to the Imperium, something else lurked. Chaos, the ruinous powers, the dark gods themselves, hidden behind layers of metaphor and obfuscation, are but present nonetheless. The old faith of Colchis wasn't just another imperial religion. It was chaos worship disguised, sanitized, made palatable. And when Erebus realized this, everything changed. One day, standing in his quarters, he looked into a mirror. It was cracked, the glass fractured in such a way that it split his reflection into 4 separate images. 4 faces looking back at him, distinct yet unified. And in that moment of revelation, Erebus understood. The 4 faces weren't just reflections. They were the dark gods, Khorne and Nurgle, Tsench and Slanesh, showing him the truth that had always existed just beneath the surface of his consciousness. The ruinous powers had been with him all along. They had guided his hands when he murdered the first Erebus. They had whispered in his dreams, shaped his desires, and nurtured the darkness that was his true nature. He wasn't alone in his wickedness. He was chosen, selected by powers beyond mortal comprehension to serve as their instrument in the material realm. From that moment forward, Erebus was a true believer, not in the sanitized religion that Colchis practiced openly, but in the raw, undiluted worship of chaos itself. He studied the forbidden texts with new fervor, learning the rituals and prayers that could call upon the warp's power. He became an expert in manipulation and deception, in hiding dark truths behind acceptable lies. He became, in essence, exactly what the dark gods needed him to be. When Lorgar Aurelian came to Colchis, when the Primarch of the Word-Bearers arrived to claim his homeworld, Erebus was already positioned perfectly to serve. Yet he had risen through the ranks of the priesthood, had established himself as someone knowledgeable and devoted. And when Lorgar began his religious crusade against the covenant that had ruled Colchis, Erebus simply went to ground, waiting for the right moment to emerge and offer his services to the Primarch. But even then, even as he knelt before Lorgar and swore loyalty to the Emperor and the imperial truth, Erebus was planning. He was already looking ahead, already seeing how he could use this new position, how he could corrupt and manipulate and destroy, because that was what he was, what he had always been, a destroyer wearing the mask of a builder, a serpent disguised as a servant. And the most terrible thing, when the Emperor himself came to Colchis, when the master of mankind in all his golden glory descended from the heavens, Erebus felt no awe. Where every other person on Colchis fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the Emperor's psychic might and divine presence, Erebus stood untouched. He saw the Emperor not as a god or savior, but as the anathema, the enemy of the dark gods he truly served. In that moment, looking upon the Emperor, Erebus felt something he had never felt before. Exhilaration. Here was the man he would one day bring low, the mighty Emperor whose Imperium he would shatter. The challenge of it thrilled him, the sheer impossibility making the eventual victory all the sweeter in his imagination. He was inducted into the Word-Bearers Legion, transformed into a space marine, made into something superhuman. The process should have killed him. Was the augmentation and surgery that created the Adeptus Astartes was meant to break lesser men and rebuild them into warriors worthy of the emperor's service. But Erebus survived, and perhaps more importantly, he remained unchanged in the ways that mattered. The process made him stronger, faster, harder to kill, but it didn't touch the darkness at his core. It didn't make him loyal or faithful to the emperor's vision. He was still Erebus, still the boy who had strangled his namesake without remorse, still the acolyte who had seen the dark gods in a cracked mirror and pledged himself to their service. Only now, he was wearing the armor of a space marine, bearing the colors of the 17th Legion, speaking words of loyalty, while his heart remained as black as the void between stars. And this is where his story truly begins. Where the child from Colchis becomes the architect of humanity's downfall. But before we can understand what Erebus did, we need to understand who he did it to. We need to understand Lorgar Aurelian, the Primarch of the Word-Bearers, and how Erebus poisoned his faith to serve his own dark ends. Corrupting the faithful, the fall of Lorgar. To understand Erebus's greatest crime, we must first understand his greatest victim. Lorgar Aurelian, Primarch of the 17th Legion, was perhaps the most devout of all the Emperor's sons. Where other Primarchs saw the Emperor as a commander or father figure, Lorgar saw a god. Where others valued the Emperor's military genius or scientific knowledge, Lorgar worshipped his divine nature. This wasn't a cynical manipulation or political calculation. Lorgar believed, with every fiber of his transhuman being, that the Emperor was worthy of worship. He saw divinity in his father, saw proof of godhood in every miracle the Emperor performed, in every victory he achieved. And Lorgar wanted nothing more than to spread this truth, to bring all of humanity into proper worship of the divine Emperor. The Word-Bearers became crusaders in the truest sense. Where other legions simply conquered worlds and moved on, the Word-Bearers stayed to build. They raised temples and monuments. They established churches and organized worship. They converted entire populations to the faith that Lorgar preached. It slowed their progress in the Great Crusade, yes, but to Lorgar and his sons, that didn't matter. What was speed compared to ensuring that the Emperor's divinity was properly recognized? Erebus rose swiftly through the ranks of the Word-Bearers. His knowledge of religion, his charisma and speaking ability, his apparent devotion to both Lorgar and the Emperor, all of these things marked him as exceptional. He became the first chaplain of the entire legion, the spiritual leader, second only to Lorgar himself. And from this position, he began to whisper. At first, his words were subtle. He would speak of the old faith of Colchis, of the ancient powers that existed before the Emperor. He would hint at mysteries beyond human comprehension, at gods older and more terrible than anything the Imperium acknowledged. But he did it carefully, always stopping short of outright heresy, always maintaining plausible deniability. Cor Phaeron, Lorgar's adoptive father and first captain, was Erebus's ally in this. Like Erebus, Cor Phaeron had known the truth of chaos long before the Emperor arrived. Together, they worked to plant seeds of doubt in Lorgar's mind, to prepare him for the eventual revelation that would damn them all. But the moment that truly broke Lorgar, the event that shattered his faith and made him vulnerable to Erebus's manipulation, came not from the Word-Bearers themselves, but from the Emperor. Monarchia. The name itself has become synonymous with humiliation and betrayal. It was a perfect city on the world of Kor, a monument to faith and devotion that the Word-Bearers had spent decades building. Every structure was a temple, every street a prayer made manifest in stone and steel. It was Lorgar's masterpiece, proof of his legion's devotion to the Emperor's glory. The Emperor ordered it destroyed, not because it was corrupt or evil, and not because it harbored enemies or threatened the Imperium, simply because it existed as a monument to worship, because it represented everything the Emperor claimed to oppose. The imperial truth demanded that humanity abandon religion and superstition. that they embrace reason and atheism. The emperor was not a god, he claimed, and should not be worshipped as one. So he ordered Monarchia razed to the ground, and he commanded the Ultramarines, Robert Guilliman's 13th Legion, to carry out the sentence. To add insult to injury, he forced the entire Wordbearers' Legion to kneel in the ashes of their greatest achievement, while he lectured them on their failings. Imagine it. 100,000 Space Marines, warriors who had conquered worlds in their father's name, are forced to kneel in the dust while their greatest work burned around them. And above them, the Emperor himself, cold and terrible in his disappointment, declaring that everything they had done was wrong, that their devotion was unwelcome, that their faith was a mistake. Lorgar's heart broke that day. Something fundamental inside the Primarch shattered under the weight of his father's rejection. He had given everything to the Emperor, had devoted his entire existence to spreading worship of the Divine Master of mankind, and it was all worthless in his eyes. Worse than worthless, it was despised. And this is where Erebus struck. In the aftermath of Monarchia, as Lorgar struggled with his shattered faith and wounded pride, Erebus was there, always ready with exactly the right words to deepen the wound, to twist the knife. And he spoke of how the word-bearers had been punished for their loyalty, how their devotion had earned them only scorn. He whispered that perhaps the Emperor wasn't worthy of worship after all, that perhaps they had been mistaken in seeing him as divine. But if the Emperor wasn't a god, Erebus suggested, that didn't mean gods didn't exist. Perhaps there were other powers in the universe worthy of worship, other entities that would appreciate the devotion Lorgar was so desperate to give, powers that wouldn't reject their followers, that would embrace faith rather than despise it. It took time. Lorgar wasn't stupid, and his faith in the Emperor, however wounded, didn't simply vanish overnight. But Erebus was patient. He worked on Lorgar's psyche like a sculptor works on stone, carefully chipping away at resistance, and shaping doubt and pain into something new. And alongside him, Corferon added his own poison, reminding Lorgar of the old faith of Colchis, of the powers they had worshipped before the Emperor came. Finally, Lorgar agreed to a pilgrimage. He would take a small force into the Eye of Terror itself, into that great wound in reality, where the warp bled through into the material universe. He would seek the truth, whatever it might be, and if gods existed beyond the Emperor, he would find them. Erebus was ecstatic. Everything was proceeding exactly as he had planned. The pilgrimage would expose Lorgar to the ruinous powers directly, would strip away any remaining doubts and transform the Primarch into a willing servant of chaos. And once Lorgar fell, the entire Wordbearers' Legion would follow him into damnation. But the pilgrimage was exactly as terrible as one might expect. Those Wordbearers who entered the Eye of Terror saw things that mortal minds weren't meant to comprehend, experienced horrors that left them fundamentally changed. But they also received visions, prophecies, promises of power beyond imagination. They met entities that claimed to be the true gods of the universe, beings that existed in the warp and fed on the emotions of mortal creatures. Lorgar saw the truth of chaos, unfiltered and undeniable. He saw the dark gods in all their terrible majesty, saw proof of their existence and power, and he fell to his knees in worship, just as Erebus had known he would. But this time, his prayers weren't directed toward the Emperor. This time, he pledged himself to Chaos Undivided, to the service of all four ruinous powers. What the Wordbearers emerged from the Eye of Terror transformed. They weren't the zealous crusaders who had entered. They were something darker now, something corrupted. They had seen the truth that lay beneath reality, had gazed upon the face of chaos itself, and they had chosen to serve it willingly. But Erebus wasn't content with corrupting his own legion. That was merely the first step, the foundation upon which he would build his greatest work. Because Lorgar was a Primarch, yes, powerful and influential, but he wasn't the War Master. He wasn't Horus Lupercal, the favored son of the Emperor, the one the Imperium trusted above all others. If Erebus wanted to truly break the Imperium, if he wanted to shatter the Emperor's dream and plunge the galaxy into chaos, he needed to corrupt Horus. And fortunately for his dark designs, the Word-Bearers had recently made contact with another legion, one that would give Erebus the perfect opportunity to put his plans into motion. The Lunar Wolves, Horus's own legion, and with them, a chance to poison the very heart of the Imperium itself. The stolen blade, betraying the Interrex. The Lunar Wolves, soon to be renamed the Sons of Horus in honor of their Primarch, were the pride of the Great Crusade. They were the tip of the spear, the legion that led the way, the warriors who conquered more worlds than any other. And at their head stood Horus Lupercal, the Emperor's chosen war master, the son who would command all the legions in his absence. Horus was everything a Primarch should be, charismatic and brilliant, a tactical genius and inspirational leader, beloved by his sons and respected by his brothers. And if the Emperor was the apex of humanity, Horus was his perfect reflection. He embodied the best of what the Imperium could be, the shining promise of a united humanity reaching for the stars. And Erebus was going to break him. The first chaplain of the Word-Bearers had insinuated himself into Horus's expedition fleet, offering his services as an advisor and spiritual guide. At first, his presence seemed natural enough. Different legions often worked together during the Great Crusade, sharing expertise and resources. What harm could one Word-Bearer do among the hundreds of Lunar Wolves? Everything. The answer was everything. Erebus spent his time carefully building relationships, making himself useful, becoming someone Horus and the Mournival, his inner circle of advisors, would trust and listen to. He was patient, never pushing too hard, never revealing his true intentions. To most of the Lunar Wolves, he seemed like a dedicated servant of the Emperor, perhaps a bit zealous in his faith, but harmless enough. Only Garviel Loken, captain of the 10th Company, seemed to see through the facade. Loken didn't trust Erebus, couldn't explain exactly why, but felt in his gut that something was wrong with the Word-Bearer. But what could he do? What evidence did he have beyond an indefinable sense of unease? So he watched and waited, hoping his suspicions were unfounded, fearing they weren't. The opportunity Erebus had been waiting for came when the Lunar Wolves made contact with a human civilization called the Interrex. The Interrex was remarkable, a society that had achieved something the Imperium considered impossible. They had integrated multiple alien species into their civilization, living in peace and harmony with Xenos like the Kinnebrach. They had advanced technology, in some ways surpassing even the Imperium. And most incredibly, they understood chaos, knew of the warp's dangers, and had developed methods to resist corruption. To Horus, the Interrex represented a fascinating alternative, a different path humanity could have taken. He approached them with genuine interest, hoping to bring them into the Imperium peacefully, to learn from their knowledge and incorporate their strengths. The negotiations were going well, better than anyone had expected. For once, it seemed like the Great Crusade might achieve a compliance through diplomacy rather than war. Then Erebus struck. Yet the Interrex kept dangerous artifacts in a place called the Hall of Devices, a museum of sorts where they stored weapons and relics too dangerous for general use. Among these items was a blade called the Anatheme, a chaos-tainted weapon created by the Kinnebrach. The Interrex knew what it was, understood its nature, and kept it locked away where it could do no harm. Erebus infiltrated the Hall of Devices during the negotiations. Using his skills at deception and manipulation, he bypassed security measures and reached the Anatheme. Then, with cold precision, he stole it. But he didn't just steal the weapon and leave quietly. No, that wouldn't serve his purpose. Instead, he set explosives, destroying part of the building and ensuring that the theft would be discovered immediately. The Interrex, seeing their most dangerous artifact stolen, had jumped to the obvious conclusion: the Imperials had betrayed them. These newcomers who spoke of peace and cooperation had stolen a chaos weapon, proving that they were either corrupted themselves or dangerously ignorant of the warp's influence. Either way, they couldn't be trusted. The negotiations collapsed instantly. The Interrex attacked, determined to retrieve the anatheme and punish the thieves. Horus, confused and furious, tried to explain that they hadn't taken anything, that this was a misunderstanding. But the Interrex wouldn't listen, couldn't afford to listen. The stakes were too high, the danger too great. The lunar wolves fought back in self-defense, and what could have been a peaceful compliance turned into a bloody war. The Interrex, for all their advanced technology and knowledge, mans couldn't stand against a Space Marine Legion at full strength. They were defeated, their civilization shattered, their knowledge lost. Another human culture that might have taught the Imperium valuable lessons about resisting chaos was destroyed. And Erebus had exactly what he wanted. The anatheme, a weapon so perfectly suited to his purposes that he couldn't have designed it better himself. The blade had a unique property, a terrible curse woven into its very structure. If someone spoke a name to the blade and then struck with it, the weapon would become specifically deadly to that person, producing toxins and poisons tailored to their specific physiology. Even a Primarch could be killed with such a weapon, even Horus. But Erebus didn't strike at the War Master directly. That would have been too obvious, too easily traced back to him. As instead, he began the next phase of his plan, a scheme so intricate and long-term that it would take months to bear fruit. He needed to arrange circumstances perfectly to ensure that when Horus fell, it would be in exactly the right way, in the right place, with the right people present to guide his corruption. He sent the anatheme to a world called Davin, a planet the lunar wolves had brought into imperial compliance years earlier. The planetary governor there, Eugen Temba, had been a close friend of Horus during the initial campaign, but in the years since, something had changed. Temba had fallen to the worship of Nurgle, the plague god, and Davin had become a festering wound of corruption. Erebus gave Temba the anatheme, along with very specific instructions. When Horus came to bring Davin back into compliance, when the War Master confronted his old friend personally, Temba was to speak Horus's name to the blade and strike with all his corrupted might. The War Master would be wounded, mortally so, and then the real work could begin. All Erebus had to do was ensure Horus would actually go to Davin, that the War Master would lead the expedition personally rather than delegating to one of his captains. And that part was easy. Horus was prideful, like all the Primarchs. When word came that one of his old companions had rebelled, that a world he personally had brought into compliance had fallen away, the insult would demand his personal attention. Everything was in place. The anatheme was positioned. The trap was set. The stage was prepared for the fall of the War Master. All that remained was to spring it, or to lure Horus to Davin's moon and begin the final phase of his corruption. And true to form, when reports came of Davin's rebellion, Horus responded exactly as Erebus had predicted. The War Master assembled his forces and set course for the Davin system, fully intending to personally bring his former friend back into line. He had no idea he was sailing directly into a trap, that the friendly chaplain who had served him so faithfully was about to destroy everything he believed in. Garviel Loken, watching Erebus's subtle pleasure at the news of Davin's rebellion, felt his suspicions deepen. But what could he do? They were already committed to the campaign. He could only watch and wait, hoping his dark imaginings were wrong, fearing with growing certainty that they weren't. The fleet entered the Davin system. And Erebus began the final preparations for his masterwork. The corruption of the War Master was about to begin. The fall of the War Master, Davin's moon. The moon of Davin was a nightmare made manifest. Where the planet below had once been a harsh but inhabitable world, the moon had been transformed into something worse, a breeding ground for the plague gifts of Nurgle. Eugen Temba, once a loyal imperial governor, had become a bloated mockery of humanity, his body swollen with disease and corruption. Horus, seeing the evidence of his friend's betrayal, felt a mixture of anger and sorrow. This was personal in a way few battles were for the War Master. Temba had been a companion during the early days of the Great Crusade, a reminder of humanity's capacity for loyalty and courage. Seeing him fall to corruption was a wound to Horus's pride and a reminder of how fragile human faith could be. The War Master ordered an assault on Temba's stronghold, a crashed Imperial ship that the governor had fortified and filled with his plague-ridden followers. But rather than command from orbit or the rear, Horus did exactly what Erebus had predicted he would do. He led the attack personally, determined to confront Temba face to face and, if possible, give his old friend a clean death.
I want to take a moment here to share something that struck me while putting this together. I've covered a lot of Warhammer villains on this channel, Demon Princes, Chaos Lords, even some of the traitors, Primarchs themselves. And you know what? Most of them have at least one moment where you can understand them, maybe even sympathize a little. Angron was a slave, Magnus was trying to help. Even Horus thought he was betrayed at first. But Erebus, there is nothing there. No tragedy, no corruption, no moment where things went wrong. He was always this way, and after thousands of years, he hasn't changed at all. And honestly, that's what makes him terrifying in a way the big dramatic villains aren't. Because we've all met people like Erebus, maybe not on a galaxy-destroying scale, but that same energy of someone who betrays trust without a second thought. That's why he resonates, that's why we hate him so much. But anyway, back to the story.
The battle was brutal. The lunar wolves advanced through corridors filled with disease and corruption, fighting enemies that should have been dead, but kept moving through Nurgle's dark blessing. The air itself seemed thick with contagion, every breath a risk, every surface potentially fatal to touch. But they pressed on, us driven by their Primarch's will and their own determination. Finally, Horus found Temba in what had once been the ship's command center. The governor had become something barely recognizable as human, his body grotesquely transformed by disease. But in his hands, he held the anathema, the blade Erebus had given him for this exact purpose. Temba spoke, his voice a wet gurgle through corrupted lungs. He tried to convince Horus to join him, to embrace the gifts that Nurgle offered, to turn away from the Emperor who had left them all to fight his crusade, while he remained safe on Terra. Horus refused, disgusted by what his friend had become, determined to end this corruption before it could spread. They fought. A Primarch against a plague-ridden human, the outcome should have been certain from the first moment, and it nearly was. Horus was faster, stronger, incomparably more skilled. Within seconds he had struck Temba down, his power claw tearing through corrupted flesh. But in his death throes, Temba managed one final act. He spoke Horus's name to the anathema, activating its dark power, and drove the blade into the War Master's shoulder. The tip penetrated between armor plates, plunging into flesh that should have been nearly invulnerable. Horus barely noticed at first. It was a minor wound, the kind of injury that his superhuman physiology would heal within minutes. He pulled the blade free and tossed it aside, more concerned with ensuring Temba was truly dead than with his own minor injury. He ordered the withdrawal, the objective achieved, ready to move on to cleansing the rest of Davin's system. Then the pain began. What the wound should have been closing already, the Laraman cells in Horus's blood clotting and sealing the injury. Instead, it continued to bleed. Worse, it began to burn with a pain unlike anything the War Master had experienced before. By the time they returned to the flagship Vengeful Spirit, Horus was pale and weakening, the toxins in his blood spreading despite his enhanced physiology. The apothecaries worked frantically to stabilize him. They had dealt with injuries to Space Marines countless times, knew every technique for treating the superhuman warriors. But nothing worked. Horus's condition continued to deteriorate, the wound festering despite every treatment they tried. The Laraman cells weren't functioning, as if the War Master's own body had forgotten how to heal itself. Captain Garviel Loken watched in horror as his Primarch weakened. This shouldn't be possible. Primarchs didn't simply die from a single stab wound. They were nearly immortal, capable of surviving injuries that would kill even a Space Marine. But here was Horus, the greatest of them all, dying from what should have been a trivial injury. And into this crisis stepped Erebus, with exactly the solution he had been preparing for months. He approached the Mournival, Horus's closest advisors, with apparent concern and humility. He spoke of the natives of Davin, of their shamanic traditions and mysterious healing rituals. The Serpent Lodge, he explained, was a group of warrior priests who practiced ancient healing arts. They had cured impossible wounds before, had brought men back from the brink of death through their rituals and knowledge. As perhaps, Erebus suggested carefully, they could help the War Master where Imperial medicine had failed. What harm could it do to try? Horus was dying anyway. At least this way, there was a chance of saving him. Ezekiel Abaddon, first captain of the Lunar Wolves and Horus's most loyal son, seized on the suggestion like a drowning man grasping for a rope. He couldn't bear to watch his father die, couldn't accept that the War Master might simply perish from a single wound. If there was any chance of saving Horus, any hope at all, they had to take it. Only Garviel Loken objected. He argued that they couldn't trust these natives, that their rituals might be corrupt or dangerous, but his arguments fell on deaf ears. Abaddon and the others were desperate, willing to try anything to save their Primarch. They overruled Loken's concerns and agreed to transport Horus to a temple on Davin's surface, where the Serpent Lodge could perform their ritual. They didn't realize they were delivering Horus directly into Chaos's hands. The temple was ancient and dark, filled with symbols that would have alarmed anyone who knew the signs of corruption. But the Mournival saw only their dying father, only the desperate hope that this might save him. They laid Horus upon a great altar while the priests of the Serpent Lodge began their chanting, their prayers to powers they didn't name openly. The ritual worked after a fashion. Horus's body stabilized, the toxins in his blood neutralized by the power flowing through the temple. But his consciousness had been cast into the warp, ere his spirit pulled from his body and thrown into that realm of nightmares and impossible horror that lay beneath reality. And there, in the warp, Erebus was waiting for him. Using his power and knowledge of chaos, Erebus had projected his own consciousness into the Imperium. He wore the face of Hastur Sejanus, one of Horus's most trusted captains who had died in an earlier campaign. The disguise was perfect, and in his weakened and confused state, Horus believed he was speaking with his old friend. Erebus, as Sejanus, guided Horus through visions carefully crafted to break the War Master's loyalty to the Emperor. He showed Horus the future, the Imperium, as it would become after the heresy. A grim and terrible place where the Emperor was worshipped as a god, where humanity stagnated in superstition and ignorance, or where everything the Great Crusade had fought for was twisted into mockery. What Erebus didn't tell Horus, of course, was that this future would only come to pass because of Horus's own betrayal. The visions were true, but they were a self-fulfilling prophecy. Horus saw himself written out of history, saw his achievements forgotten and his name cursed, saw the Emperor taking all the glory while his sons were left to rot in obscurity. The anger and resentment that Erebus had been carefully nurturing in Horus's heart throughout their time together blossomed into full rage. The Emperor had abandoned them, Horus thought. He had left his sons to fight his crusade, while he returned to Terra for his own mysterious purposes. He took the glory, but shared none of the burden. He demanded loyalty, but gave nothing in return. Then, the Chaos Gods themselves appeared, or at least projections of their power. They spoke to Horus, offered him everything he could want. Power beyond imagination, glory eternal, revenge against the Emperor who had used him and cast him aside. All he had to do was serve them, to turn away from the Emperor and embrace the truth of chaos. Magnus the Red, the Primarch of the Thousand Suns, and perhaps the most powerful Psyker among the Emperor's sons, sensed what was happening. He projected his own consciousness into the warp, trying to warn Horus, trying to break through Erebus's lies and show his brother the truth. But he was too late. The poison had already taken root. The corruption had already spread too deep. Horus made his choice. He accepted the power the dark gods offered, pledged himself to their service, and in doing so, had condemned the galaxy to 10,000 years of war and suffering. When he awakened in the temple, his wounds were healed, but something fundamental had changed. The War Master who had served the Emperor faithfully was gone, replaced by something darker, something willing to tear the Imperium apart to satisfy his wounded pride. Erebus watched it all with cold satisfaction. Everything had proceeded exactly as planned. The War Master was corrupted, turned against the Emperor, ready to begin the great war that would shatter humanity's unity forever. All that remained was to begin the rebellion itself, to purge the loyalists from the traitor legions and prepare for the inevitable conflict. The Horus heresy was about to begin, and Erebus had been its architect every step of the way, but he wasn't done yet. As the corruption of Horus was merely the opening move, now came the real work, turning the War Master's fall into a galaxy-spanning catastrophe that would please the dark gods and damn humanity forever. And it would begin at a world called Istvan III, with a betrayal so complete and terrible that it would echo through 10,000 years of history. Istvan III, the first betrayal. The world of Istvan III was unremarkable, just another imperial planet that had fallen into rebellion and needed to be brought back into compliance. The Emperor, still ignorant of Horus's corruption, had charged his War Master with crushing this uprising, never suspecting that Horus would use this command as an opportunity for something far darker. 4 legions assembled in the Istvan system. The sons of Horus, formerly the Lunar Wolves, who followed their War Master without question. The World Eaters, Angron's blood-crazed berserkers who cared only for battle and slaughter. The Death Guard, Mortarian's grim and implacable warriors who specialized in warfare of attrition. And the Emperor's children, Fulgrim's perfectionists who pursued excellence in all things. All 4 legions had turned traitor, their primarchs corrupted by chaos and committed to Horus's rebellion. But within each legion, there were still loyalists, Space Marines who remained faithful to the Emperor despite their primarch's fall. Terran-born warriors who remembered the Emperor personally, or simply those whose faith in the Imperium couldn't be shaken. They were a minority, but they existed in every legion, a potential threat to the coming rebellion. Horus, with Erebus's counsel, decided to deal with this problem before beginning the war in earnest. He couldn't afford to have loyalists in his ranks when he moved against Terra, couldn't risk them turning on him at a critical moment. So he devised a plan, a purge disguised as a standard compliance action that would eliminate all the questionable elements in one stroke. The first wave of the assault on Istvan III was carefully composed. Rather than sending entire companies or chapters, as was standard practice, Horus handpicked individual squads and warriors. To the legions, it seemed like an honor, being chosen for the spear tip of the attack. To those with eyes to see, like Captain Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children, it was suspicious. Too much of a deviation from standard procedure. Tarvitz's suspicions deepened when he noticed that all the warriors selected for the first wave were either known loyalists or those whose loyalty was uncertain. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Something was wrong, but he couldn't quite see what it was. Then, working on a hunch, Tarvitz managed to stay aboard the flagship instead of deploying with the first wave. And there, in the ship's armory, he discovered the truth. Virus bombs, life-eater warheads, weapons of mass destruction that would kill every living thing on the planet's surface, and they were being prepared for immediate deployment. The betrayal became horribly clear. Horus was going to deploy the loyalists to the surface, let them believe they were conducting a normal assault, and then unleash the life-eater virus on them, while the virus would consume every organic molecule on the planet, turning Istvan III into a dead world, and all the loyalists who might have opposed Horus would die without ever realizing their Primarch had betrayed them. Tarvitz didn't hesitate. He commandeered a Thunderhawk gunship and dove toward the planet's surface, racing against time to warn his brothers before the virus bombs fell. Behind him, loyal Death Guard captain Nathaniel Garrow fought to take control of his frigate, the Eisenstein, so he could escape the system and carry word of the betrayal to Terra. On the surface of Istvan III, in the capital city called the Choral City, the first wave was encountering resistance from the planetary defense forces. Nothing they couldn't handle, but enough to keep them engaged and distracted. As when Tarvitz's Thunderhawk screamed out of the sky, broadcasting warnings on all frequencies, most of the Astartes didn't understand what he was saying. Virus bombs? Their own Primarchs betraying them? It was impossible, unthinkable, but Tarvitz was a respected captain, not someone given to hysteria or lies. And then they looked up and saw the bombardment beginning, saw the warheads falling like deadly rain, and the truth became unavoidable. Those who believed Tarvitz ran for shelter, seeking bunkers and sealed structures that might protect them from the virus. Those who hesitated, who couldn't believe their fathers would truly betray them, died screaming as the Life Eater consumed them from the inside out. The virus was horror made manifest. It didn't just kill, it consumed. Organic matter broke down at the molecular level, of flesh dissolving, bones liquefying, every living thing on the planet dying in agony. 12 billion people died in minutes. Their death screams so powerful in the warp that it was said to be louder than the Astronomicon itself. But some survived. Perhaps 2/3 of the loyalist Astartes made it to shelter in time, sealing themselves in bunkers and underground structures. The virus couldn't penetrate their armor or breach their shelters, and so they lived through the bombardment, emerging into a world transformed into a charnel house. Horus, watching from orbit, was furious. The purge should have been complete. Instead, thousands of loyalists had survived, and they were now fully aware of his betrayal. They knew that their Primarchs had turned traitor, that the War Master himself had forsaken the Emperor. And they were trapped on the planet's surface with no hope of escape, which meant they would fight with the desperation of men who had nothing left to lose. Angron, the Primarch of the World Eaters, didn't care about Horus's plans or strategic considerations. His loyalist sons were on the surface, and he wanted them dead. Without authorization, the Red Angel led 50 companies of World Eaters in a direct assault on the survivors, determined to finish what the virus bombs had started. What followed was one of the most bitter battles in Imperial history. The Loyalists, led by Garviel Loken, Tarik Torgadon, and Saul Tarvitz, transformed the ruins of the Choral City into a fortress. They knew they couldn't win, knew there was no relief coming, no hope of survival. But they could delay the traitors. He could buy time for word of the betrayal to reach Terra, could make Horus pay for his treachery in blood and time. The siege lasted for weeks. Horus was forced to commit more and more resources to Istvan III, to send additional troops to break the loyalist defense. Every day that passed was another day for the news of his betrayal to spread, another day for the Emperor to prepare a response. The clean purge had become a prolonged and costly battle. Erebus, watching the siege drag on, saw his careful plans begin to fray at the edges. The betrayal at Istvan III was supposed to be the opening move in a swift and decisive rebellion. Instead, it had become a quagmire, a symbol of loyalist resistance that inspired others to remain faithful to the Emperor. But even this setback couldn't derail the larger plan, as the word-bearers and Lorgar were already moving to the next phase, preparing for what would become known as the Drop Site Massacre at Istvan IV. The war was coming, regardless of how long the loyalists on Istvan III managed to hold out. Eventually, the defense crumbled. The loyalists, vastly outnumbered and cut off from any support, were ground down through sheer attrition. Torgadon fell in battle. Loken was buried under a collapsing building. Tarvitz fought on until the very end, until there was no one left to lead and nowhere left to retreat to. But their sacrifice wasn't meaningless. Captain Garrow had escaped in the Eisenstein, fighting his way through the traitor fleet and eventually reaching Terra to warn Rogel Dawn of Horus's betrayal. The Emperor now knew what his favored son had become. and the loyalist legions were beginning to mobilize in response. Istvan III was a betrayal, yes, but it was also a warning. It showed the Imperium exactly what Horus was capable of, the depths to which he would sink in his pursuit of power. And it created martyrs, heroes whose last stand would be remembered and honored throughout Imperial history. For Erebus, the battle was a complication, but not a disaster. The war had begun. The Imperium was fracturing, and chaos was spreading through the legions like a virus of its own. There was still so much work to do, so many schemes to weave, so many betrayals yet to come. And one betrayal in particular, one that would come later in the heresy, would cement Erebus's reputation as perhaps the most hated character in all of Warhammer 40,000. The murder of a friend, as the backstabbing of someone who trusted him, an act so cold and calculated that it would inspire fury even in the hearts of Chaos worshippers. But before we reach that moment, we need to understand the scope of Erebus's other crimes, the ways he shaped the heresy to serve his own ends and the ends of the dark gods he worshipped. The Ruin Storm, splitting the galaxy. While Horus prosecuted his war against the Imperium, Erebus continued to work behind the scenes, manipulating events and weaving schemes that would shape the course of the heresy. One of his most devastating achievements came in the aftermath of the Battle of Calth, where his actions would literally split the Imperium in two. The Battle of Calth was the Word-Bearer's attempt to destroy the Ultramarines, Robert Guilliman's 13th Legion. Lorgar held a particular hatred for the Ultramarines, seeing them as the legion that had humiliated the Word-Bearers at Monarchia, that had been chosen by the Emperor to punish his sons for their faith. The chance to destroy them was too perfect to pass up. Erebus played a key role in planning the attack. Before the battle, he had taken the anatheme, the blade that had corrupted Horus, and broken it into 8 pieces. From these shards, he forged new weapons, athame daggers that retained much of the original blade's power. He kept one for himself and gave the others to Word-Bearer's commanders who would lead the assault on Calth. These blades would be used to wound important imperial figures, to spread corruption and chaos throughout the loyalist ranks. Corfairan, Erebus's ally and Lorgar's foster father, he even managed to stab Robert Guilliman himself with one of these daggers. The Ultramarine Primarch survived, but the wound would have lasting consequences. But the athame daggers were merely tools in a larger ritual. What Erebus truly sought at Calth was the power to summon the Ruin Storm. The Ruin Storm was a warp storm of unprecedented scale, a tear in reality so vast that it would engulf entire sectors of space. Ships traveling through the warp would be lost, unable to navigate through the chaos and fury of the storm. Communication would become impossible, with astropathic messages unable to penetrate the interference. Entire regions of the Imperium would be cut off from each other, isolated and unable to coordinate their defense. In the aftermath of Calth, as the battle raged between Word-Bearers and Ultramarines, Erebus conducted the ritual that would birth this storm. Using the athame daggers, channeling the blood and death from the battle, calling upon powers that mortals were never meant to touch, he tore open the veil between reality and the warp. The Ruin Storm erupted into being, a cosmic wound that split the galaxy in two. On one side was Terra, the heart of the Imperium, and the loyalist legions that might defend it. On the other side were 3 Primarchs and their legions who had remained loyal to the Emperor, Sanguinius and his Blood Angels, the Lion and his Dark Angels, and Guilliman with the surviving Ultramarines. These 3 Primarchs were some of the Emperor's most powerful and reliable sons, exactly the warriors he would need to defend Terra from Horus's assault. And now they were cut off, unable to reach the throne world, forced to fight their way through warp storms and demon incursions just to have a chance of rejoining the fight. The strategic impact of the Ruin Storm cannot be overstated. With these 3 legions delayed, Horus had a window of opportunity to strike at Terra before the full weight of loyalist resistance could be brought to bear. It meant that when the siege of Terra finally began, the Emperor would have far fewer defenders than he should have had. But the ruin storm's effects went beyond mere strategy. It was a wound in reality itself, a place where the warp bled through into the material universe. Demons could manifest more easily within its bounds. Chaos corruption spread faster. Entire worlds were consumed by the madness pouring through that cosmic tear. Millions died in the storms. Ships were lost, their crews driven mad or torn apart by warp predators. Entire systems went dark, cut off from the Imperium, and left to fend for themselves against whatever horrors emerged from the breach. The ruin storm was a testament to the power of chaos, proof of what could be achieved when someone like Erebus was given the freedom and resources to pursue his dark work. And Erebus, standing in the aftermath of the ritual, surveyed his handiwork with satisfaction. The galaxy was burning, just as the dark gods had promised it would. The Imperium was tearing itself apart, brother fighting brother, Primarch against Primarch. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. But even as he savored his victory, Erebus was already planning his next move. There were still threats to the traitor cause, still obstacles that needed to be removed. And one such obstacle was walking around in the form of a possessed word-bearer named Argel Tal, whose influence on certain key figures was beginning to concern Erebus. The murder of Argel Tal would be, in many ways, Erebus's most personal crime, the act that would earn him more hatred from fans than perhaps any other. Because Argel Tal wasn't just another enemy to be eliminated. He was a brother word-bearer, a loyal servant of chaos, and someone who had done nothing to deserve the betrayal that was coming. But Erebus didn't care about loyalty or brotherhood or any bonds of honor. He cared only about the will of the dark gods and his own advancement. And if Argel Tal had to die to serve those ends, then die he would. The ultimate treachery. Murder of Argel Tal. To understand why Erebus's murder of Argel Tal generates such hatred, we need to understand who Argel Tal was and what he represented in the darkness of the Horus heresy. Argel Tal was a captain in the Wordbearers, leader of the Gal Vorbak, the first Chaos Space Marines to be possessed by demons. He had been among those who entered the Eye of Terror during Lorgar's pilgrimage, and he had emerged bonded with a demon named Raum. The possession should have destroyed his personality, should have turned him into a raving monster. Instead, Argel Tal retained his consciousness, existing in a strange symbiosis with the entity that inhabited his flesh. Despite his corruption, despite the demon that wore his body like a suit of armor, Argel Tal remained remarkably human. He was loyal to Lorgar, yes, and committed to the cause of chaos, but he also retained qualities that seemed out of place in a traitor legion. Yet he formed genuine friendships. He questioned orders when they seemed wrong. He showed mercy when mercy wasn't strategically necessary. Most notably, he had formed a deep friendship with Khan of the World Eaters, the warrior who would one day become known as the Betrayer. Despite their differences, despite coming from legions with very different philosophies and approaches to war, the two had become close during the Shadow Crusade, the joint Wordbearers and World Eaters campaign to destroy the Ultramarines' realm of Ultramar. Argel Tal was also close to a woman named Cyrene Valantion, a confessor who had survived the razing of Monarchia and been rendered blind by the psychic shock of witnessing the Emperor's wrath. Argel Tal had rescued her from the ashes of that destroyed city, and over the years they had formed a bond that transcended the usual relationship between Space Marine and mortal human. When Cyrene was killed during the drop site massacre at Istvan Fev, Argel Tal was devastated. In his grief, he made a terrible mistake. He listened to Erebus. Erebus approached Argel Tal with an offer. He claimed he could resurrect Cyrene, could bring her back from death through the power of chaos. All Argel Tal had to do was retrieve her remains and deliver them to Erebus for the ritual. It was manipulation of the cruelest kind, preying on grief and love to serve Erebus's own purposes. Argel Tal, desperate to undo his failure to protect Cyrene, agreed. With Khan's help, he retrieved her body from the cultists who had taken it. Erebus performed his ritual, and incredibly, it worked. Cyrene was resurrected, At her sight restored, her life returned. For a brief moment, Argel Tal knew joy, knew the relief of having righted a terrible wrong. But Erebus had his own reasons for this seeming kindness. He was earning Argel Tal's trust, making himself seem like an ally and friend. Because Erebus had seen something in the warp's currents, a potential future that concerned him. He had seen that Argel Tal's influence on Khan might prevent the World Eater from fully embracing Horn's gifts, that their friendship might hold Khan back from becoming the perfect weapon of the Blood God, and that couldn't be allowed. Khan had to fall completely to Khorne, had to become the betrayer, had to embody the mindless rage and bloodlust that the Blood God demanded from his champions. As long as Argel Tal lived, as long as that friendship endured, there was a chance Khan might retain some measure of restraint, some connection to his former humanity. So Erebus decided Argel Tal had to die. The opportunity came during the Battle of Nuceria, the World Eater's assault on their Primarch Angron's homeworld. The battle was going poorly, the forces of the Red Angel being pushed back by unexpected resistance. In the chaos and confusion of the fighting, Erebus saw his chance. He found Argel Tal separated from his squad, vulnerable in a way the possessed word-bearer rarely was. Erebus approached with his Athame dagger drawn, but Argel Tal, sensing no threat from a fellow word-bearer, didn't raise his guard. They were brothers in chaos, after all. They served the same cause, worshipped the same gods. Then, without warning or explanation, Erebus struck, and he plunged his Athame into Argel Tal's back, driving the blade deep into organs that were part flesh and part demon. The weapon's power disrupted the bond between Argel Tal and Raum, causing the demon to be torn away, leaving Argel Tal's enhanced but mortal flesh suddenly vulnerable. Argel Tal, even mortally wounded, even betrayed by someone he had trusted, managed to turn and face his killer. He asked Erebus why, what had driven this betrayal. Erebus's answer was chilling in its casual cruelty. He claimed that Argel Tal's influence on Khan was holding the World Eater back from his destiny, that the dark gods required Khan to become something more savage, more devoted to slaughter. Argel Tal's friendship was an obstacle to that transformation, so Erebus had removed the obstacle. Argel Tal died in the shadow of a crashed Imperator Titan bearing an Imperial Aquila, fulfilling a prophecy that he would die beneath great wings. But there was no glory in his death, no honorable end in service to the dark gods. He died because Erebus found it convenient, murdered by someone he had considered an ally for reasons that had nothing to do with Argel Tal's actions or loyalties. When Khan discovered what had happened, when he learned that Erebus had murdered his closest friend, the World Eater's rage was apocalyptic. He challenged Erebus to single combat, determined to avenge Argel Tal's death. The duel that followed has become legendary among Warhammer fans. Khan, already well on his way to becoming the betrayer, fought with a fury born of genuine grief and loss. Erebus, for all his psychic power and dark knowledge, it discovered that he was badly outmatched in physical combat against one of the World Eater's finest warriors. Khan beat him, not killed him, but beat him so badly that Erebus was forced to teleport away to avoid being torn apart. The word-bearer's carefully maintained facade of control shattered under the assault, his arrogance giving way to genuine fear. For perhaps the first time in his life, Erebus faced real consequences for his actions, felt real pain and terror. But he survived. He always survives. That's part of what makes Erebus so frustrating to fans. No matter how many times he's defeated, no matter how badly his schemes go wrong, he always manages to escape, to continue plotting, to remain a threat. He's like a cosmic cockroach, impossible to truly exterminate. Or the murder of Argel Tal represents everything fans hate about Erebus. It wasn't strategic or necessary. It wasn't done in service to some greater goal or higher purpose. It was simply convenient for Erebus's plans, and so he did it, caring nothing for bonds of brotherhood or loyalty to a shared cause. He betrayed his own side, murdered a fellow Chaos worshipper, destroyed a genuine friendship between two warriors who had found connection despite their differences. And he did it all without remorse, without hesitation, without even trying to justify it as anything more than expediency. That's what makes Erebus different from other villains in Warhammer 40,000. Most traitors have reasons for what they do, even if those reasons are twisted or evil. They have goals, motivations, and things they believe in strongly enough to damn themselves for. Erebus just doesn't care. He serves chaos because it gives him power. He betrays because it advances his position. He murders because it removes obstacles. There's no tragic backstory, no corruption arc, no moment where we can see the person he might have been before he fell. He's always been this way, and he always will be. But even this wasn't Erebus's final crime during the heresy. He continued to scheme and manipulate throughout the war, continued to advance his own agenda even as Horus's rebellion slowly began to fail. And his actions would have consequences that extended beyond the heresy itself, shaping the dark future of the 41st millennium. His failures and punishments. Even villains suffer. For all his scheming and success in corrupting the Imperium, where Erebus's path through the heresy wasn't one of uninterrupted triumph, there were failures, setbacks, moments where his arrogance exceeded his capabilities and he paid the price for his hubris. One of his most significant failures came at the Battle of Cygnus Prime, a campaign against the Blood Angels Legion that Erebus had personally championed. The plan was to corrupt the Blood Angels and their Primarch Sanguinius, to turn the noble Ninth Legion into servants of chaos. It was an ambitious goal, given Sanguinius's reputation as perhaps the most incorruptible of all the Primarchs. Erebus threw enormous resources into the campaign, summoning greater demons and corrupting the entire Cygnus system into a nightmare realm designed specifically to break the Blood Angels' will. He orchestrated attacks on their greatest strengths and trying to turn their nobility into weakness, their brotherhood into division. It failed. Spectacularly. Sanguinius resisted every temptation, fought off every demon, and ultimately led his legion to victory, despite the odds against them. The Blood Angels emerged from Cygnus damaged but unbroken, their loyalty to the Emperor intact. Erebus's grand scheme had accomplished nothing except to delay one legion and waste valuable resources that the traitor cause could have used elsewhere. But the real punishment came from Horus himself. Erebus, in his arrogance, made the mistake of blaming the War Master for his failure at Cygnus. He claimed that Horus's interference, his orders that pulled resources away from the campaign, had doomed Erebus's carefully laid plans. He said this to Horus's face in front of other witnesses, as apparently forgetting that even the servants of chaos have hierarchies, and that questioning the War Master was unwise. Horus, whose corruption hadn't completely destroyed his tactical brilliance or his pride, responded to this insolence with terrible clarity. He took Erebus's own athame, the dagger the word-bearer carried as a symbol of his role in corrupting the War Master, and used it to flay the skin from Erebus's face. It was a punishment designed to be both painful and humiliating. Erebus had worn his tattooed face as a mark of pride, the visible symbol of his devotion to chaos and his role in the heresy. Horus stripped that away, literally peeling off the skin that bore those sacred marks. When the wound eventually healed, it healed wrong, leaving Erebus's face horribly mutated and scarred, a permanent reminder of his failure and presumption. From that point forward, Erebus found himself increasingly marginalized by the very rebellion he had helped create. Both Horus and Lorgar, recognizing his toxic influence and unreliable loyalty, began to distance themselves from him. They used his knowledge and abilities when convenient, but kept him at arm's length, never fully trusting him with their most important plans. In a sense, Erebus had become a victim of his own nature. His willingness to betray anyone for personal advantage made him too dangerous to keep close. His schemes within schemes, his habit of pursuing his own agenda, even when it contradicted the goals of his supposed allies, made him more liability than asset. During the later stages of the heresy and the Siege of Terror, Erebus found himself operating increasingly alone, conducting his own operations separate from the main traitor force. He still had power, still had influence, but he was no longer the architect of the rebellion strategy, no longer the trusted advisor whispering in the War Master's ear. There's a certain poetic justice in this. Erebus, who had built his power on betrayal and manipulation, found himself isolated by those same qualities. He had corrupted and destroyed so many others that eventually, even his fellow traitors wanted nothing to do with him. But perhaps his greatest punishment came not from any external source, but from the nature of chaos itself. Erebus had pledged himself to all four dark gods equally, worshipping chaos undivided, rather than dedicating himself to a single patron. This gave him access to a wide range of powers and knowledge, but it also meant he never achieved the heights of power that dedicated champions of individual gods could reach. He would never become a demon prince, never ascend to that state of semi-immortality and godlike power that was the ultimate reward for Chaos's greatest servants. The dark gods valued him as a tool, used him as an instrument to spread corruption and discord, but they never elevated him above his station. He remained mortal, remained vulnerable, remained always striving for a transcendence that would never come. In the end, Erebus achieved everything he set out to do and gained nothing for it. He corrupted Lorgar and Horus. He sparked the heresy. He split the Imperium and condemned humanity to 10,000 years of darkness. But he himself remained what he had always been, a space marine playing politics among gods, forever reaching for power that would always remain just slightly out of reach. And yet he persisted. Because if there's one thing that defines Erebus, it's his absolute refusal to admit defeat or recognize when he's been outmaneuvered. He survived the heresy, survived Horus's death and the traitor retreat into the Eye of Terror, and continued scheming in the dark millennia that followed. Which brings us to the present day, to the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, where Erebus still walks and plots, still works to advance his agenda and serve the dark gods who have used him for so long. The present darkness, Erebus in the 41st millennium. 10,000 years have passed since the Horus heresy. The Imperium has become a parody of everything the Emperor fought for, a stagnant theocracy where the Emperor himself is worshipped as a god. The very thing he sought to prevent has come to pass, proving that even in failure, Erebus shaped the future. In the Eye of Terror, on the demon world of Sycharis, the word-bearers maintain their dark stronghold, and there, as a member of the Dark Council that rules the Legion, sits Erebus. He has survived where so many others fell, has endured through centuries of warfare and intrigue within the Eye's twisted realm. His position on the Dark Council gives him power and influence, but it also puts him in constant conflict with Corferon, his old ally turned rival. The two Dark Apostles play endless games of political maneuvering, each trying to gain the upper hand, and each working to become the true power behind the Wordbearer's throne. Lorgar himself has withdrawn from active leadership of the Legion. The Primarch sits in meditation on Sycharis, contemplating mysteries of chaos that even his most devoted followers cannot fathom. With their father effectively absent, Erebus and Corferon are free to pursue their own agendas, shaping the Wordbearers according to their rival visions. Erebus continues to work toward the goals he has always pursued, spreading chaos worship, corrupting the Imperium from within, advancing the agenda of the ruinous powers. He maintains networks of cultists and corrupted officials throughout Imperial space, planting seeds that may not bear fruit for centuries, but will eventually contribute to humanity's downfall. During the 13th Black Crusade, on Abaddon the Despoiler's massive assault on the Cadian Gate, Erebus emerged from the Eye of Terror, leading Wordbearer's forces. He participated in the campaign that ultimately destroyed Cadia, that broke the pylons that had held back the warp for millennia. When the planet finally fell and the Great Rift tore across the galaxy, splitting the Imperium almost in half, Erebus could claim a measure of credit for that catastrophic victory. The Great Rift, called the Cicatrix Maledictum, is in some ways Erebus's ultimate achievement. It's the ruin storm magnified 100-fold, a permanent wound in reality that has plunged half the Imperium into darkness and isolation. The Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, exists cut off from the light of the Astronomicon, unable to navigate the warp reliably, and prey to constant demon incursions and chaos corruption. Millions of worlds have been lost to the Great Rift. Billions of humans have died in the darkness that followed its opening. The Imperium faces threats from all sides. Chaos from within the rift, tyrannids from beyond the galaxy, orcs rallying under powerful warlords, Necrons awakening from their ancient tombs, Tau expanding their empire. Humanity is besieged as never before, fighting for survival on 1,000 fronts, and Erebus watches it all with satisfaction. This is what he wanted, what he worked for over the course of 10,000 years. The Imperium suffering, humanity struggling, the Dark God's power growing stronger with each soul that falls to corruption. From his perspective, everything is proceeding as it should. But even now, and even after all this time and all his victories, Erebus remains fundamentally what he has always been. He's still scheming, still plotting, still betraying his own allies when it serves his purposes. He hasn't grown or changed or evolved into something more. He's frozen in time, locked into patterns of behavior that have defined him since he was a nameless child, strangling his namesake in a Colchizian desert. There's something almost sad about that, the fact that for all his power and influence, for all the damage he's done to the galaxy, Erebus himself remains small. He never transcended his nature, never became anything more than a skilled manipulator serving powers far greater than himself. He's a tool that's been used for 10,000 years and still doesn't realize he's being used. But that realization, that moment of self-awareness, will probably never come, because to acknowledge it would require a level of introspection and honesty that Erebus fundamentally lacks. He's a creature of lies and deception, and the biggest lie he tells is to himself, the delusion that he's the architect of his own destiny rather than just another pawn in the Dark God's eternal game. In the 41st Millennium, Erebus continues to be exactly what he was in the 31st. The most hated character in Warhammer lore, the architect of humanity's downfall, the serpent who poisoned the garden, and then pretended he was doing everyone a favor. And that brings us to the question that has hung over this entire discussion. Why? Why does Erebus inspire such universal hatred? What is it about this character that makes fans despise him more than any other villain in a setting full of villains? Why we hate him? The meta-analysis in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. There is no shortage of evil. The setting is built on a foundation of grimdark horror, where the good guys are at best morally grey, and everyone else ranges from deeply flawed to apocalyptically evil. We have demon princes who literally embody the worst aspects of human nature. We have alien horrors that exist only to consume and destroy. We have mad tyrants who sacrifice millions of their own people for short-term gain. And yet, Erebus is the most hated. Not Abaddon the Despoiler, who has prosecuted a 10,000-year war against humanity. Not any of the demon primarchs who have ascended to godhood through their corruption. And not even the dark gods themselves, the chaos entities that feed on mortal suffering. Erebus, a single space marine who has never achieved true transcendence, inspires more hatred than all of them. Why? The answer lies in how Erebus is written and what he represents in the narrative. Unlike most villains in Warhammer, Erebus has no tragic backstory. There's no moment where we can sympathize with him, no point where we understand how he became what he is. He wasn't corrupted or broken or twisted by circumstance. He was always this way, rotten to the core from the very beginning. Most of the traitor primarchs, for all their evil, have elements that make them understandable, if not sympathetic. Angron was enslaved and tortured, his empathy literally carved out of his brain by the butcher's nails. Mortarion was shaped by a brutal upbringing under an undead overlord. Fulgrim was corrupted by a demon weapon. Magnus made terrible mistakes, but was trying to help his father. Even Horus, the arch-traitor himself, fell because he believed the Emperor had betrayed him. Erebus had none of that. He chose evil over and over again because it benefited him. He murdered a child to steal his identity. He worshipped chaos because it gave him power. He betrayed the Imperium because the dark gods promised him rewards. Every step of his path was a conscious choice, made with full knowledge of what he was doing. And he never shows regret, never displays doubt or hesitation or second thoughts about the terrible things he does. When he murders Argel Tal, it's done as casually as you might swat a fly. When he corrupts Horus and damns the galaxy to 10,000 years of war, he does it with satisfaction and pride. He is completely unrepentant, absolutely committed to his course, and utterly devoid of anything approaching a conscience. This makes him infuriating to watch in the narrative. Other villains at least have the decency to be conflicted, or to suffer consequences for their actions. Erebus just keeps winning, keeps escaping punishment, keeps advancing his agenda despite every effort to stop him. And then there's his role in the meta-narrative of the Horus heresy. Every terrible thing that happens in that war, every death and betrayal and tragedy, can ultimately be traced back to Erebus. He's the butterfly that started the avalanche, the first domino in a chain that toppled the entire Imperium. Without Erebus, Lorgar might never have fully embraced chaos. The word-bearers might have remained loyal, or at least neutral. Without Erebus, the Interrex might have been peacefully incorporated into the Imperium, and their knowledge of how to resist chaos could have changed everything. Without Erebus, Horus would never have been wounded by the Anatham, never been exposed to the Serpent Lodge's corruption, never fallen to the dark gods. Every single tragedy of the heresy, from Istvan III to the Siege of Terra, from the death of Sanguinius to the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne, all of it stems from Erebus's machinations. He's patient zero for the disease that infected the Imperium, and the fact that he takes pride in this rather than showing any remorse makes fans want to reach through the page and strangle him. But perhaps the most frustrating thing about Erebus is his self-awareness. He knows exactly what he is and doesn't care. In one of the heresy novels, he even reflects on how much people hate him, noting that they hate him not because of what he is, but because they see in him what they could become. It's a remarkably perceptive analysis, showing that Erebus understands human nature and his effect on others, and he uses that understanding to be even more effective at manipulation and corruption. He knows what buttons to push, what weaknesses to exploit, what lies will be most convincing. His intelligence makes him more dangerous, but it also makes him more hateable, because it means he has no excuse. He's not stupid or misguided or acting on incomplete information. He knows exactly what he's doing and chooses to do it anyway. Yet the fan community's hatred for Erebus has become a meme in its own right. Fuck Erebus is one of the most common phrases you'll see in Warhammer forums and discussion threads. There are entire subreddits dedicated to hating him. When new Horus Heresy books come out, fans half joke that they're just checking to see if this is finally the book where Erebus gets what he deserves. And yet, paradoxically, this intense hatred is also what makes Erebus such an effective character. He fulfills his narrative role perfectly. He's the villain you love to hate, the character whose every appearance makes you want to see him suffer. Good fiction needs antagonists that inspire strong emotional reactions, and Erebus certainly delivers on that front. Well, the fact that fans can have such visceral reactions to a fictional character speaks to how well he's written. Erebus isn't bland or forgettable. He's not an abstract threat or faceless evil. He's a specific, well-defined character with clear motivations and consistent behavior. We hate him because we understand him, because we can see exactly what he is and why he does what he does. In a way, Erebus represents something that resonates beyond just Warhammer lore. He's the colleague who takes credit for others' work. The friend who stabs you in the back when it's convenient. The person who lies and manipulates and schemes their way to power while claiming to serve some higher purpose. We all know someone like Erebus, or at least we know the type. And seeing that type succeed, seeing them advance and prosper while good people suffer, is deeply frustrating. It taps into a fundamental human desire for justice, for the wicked to be punished and the righteous to be rewarded. The fact that Erebus keeps escaping consequences, keeps surviving when he should face justice, makes him even more infuriating. But that's the point, really. Warhammer 40,000 isn't a setting where justice prevails or where good defeats evil. It's a universe where the best you can hope for is that evil fights itself, where victory means surviving another day rather than achieving any lasting peace. Erebus fits perfectly into this grimdark vision, representing the triumph of corruption and the endurance of wickedness. So we hate him. We hate him with a passion that transcends the usual feelings we have toward fictional villains. Well, we hate him because he represents everything wrong with the Warhammer universe, every betrayal and corruption and cynical manipulation that has brought humanity to its current state of endless suffering. And you know what? That's exactly what he was designed to do. Erebus is performing his function perfectly, being exactly what the story needs him to be. He's the villain everyone can agree to despise, the one character that unites the entire fan community in shared contempt. In that sense, Erebus has achieved something remarkable. He's become more than just a character. He's become a symbol, a representation of betrayal itself, a name that will be remembered and cursed for as long as people read Warhammer lore. When fans discover the setting and learn about the Horus heresy, learning to hate Erebus is almost a rite of passage. And that brings us to the end of this examination, to the final assessment of the most hated character in Warhammer 40,000. Conclusion: the legacy of betrayal. We've journeyed through the life and crimes of Erebus, from his origins as a nameless child on Colchis to his current position as a dark apostle in the 41st Millennium. We've seen him murder and manipulate, corrupt and betray, scheme and destroy. We've watched him architect the greatest catastrophe in human history and take pride in his work. And through it all, one truth has remained constant. Erebus is exactly what he appears to be. There's no hidden depth, no secret nobility, no moment of redemption waiting somewhere in his future. He's a creature of pure malice and self-interest, and shaped by the dark gods into the perfect instrument for spreading corruption and suffering. The galaxy he's helped create is a nightmare of endless war and darkness. The Imperium that might have been a beacon of hope and progress has become a corpse of its former self, sustained only by the suffering of countless trillions. Humanity, which might have reached for the stars and claimed the galaxy, instead cowers in the darkness, fighting for survival against threats on all sides. And it's all because of one man's whispers in the right ears at the right time. Because Erebus saw the shining edifice of the Imperium and decided to tear it down. Because he found a lonely, wounded Primarch and offered him dark comfort. Because he stole a blade and gave it to a corrupted governor. Because he murdered a friend to advance his schemes. The damage he's done is incalculable. The lives lost in the wars he sparked number in the trillions. The potential futures he destroyed, the hopes he extinguished, the dreams he corrupted, all of it adds up to a legacy of destruction that few characters in any fictional universe can match. And yet, he remains what he's always been, a tool being used by powers far greater than himself. The dark gods don't care about Erebus personally. They care about the chaos and corruption he spreads, the worship and suffering he generates in their names. If he were to die tomorrow, they would simply find another instrument, another corrupt soul to carry out their will. Erebus's tragedy, if it can be called that, is that he doesn't realize this. He thinks he's special, that he's the hand of destiny, the chosen prophet of chaos. In reality, he's just convenient. He was there at the right time with the right skills and the right lack of conscience to serve the dark god's purposes. That's all he ever was, and that's all he ever will be. But for fans of Warhammer, Erebus will always be more than that. He'll be the character we love to hate, the villain whose every appearance inspires fury and frustration. He'll be the name we curse when explaining the Horus Heresy, the first and most responsible architect of humanity's fall. The fact that a fictional character can inspire such genuine emotional response is a testament to both the quality of the writing and the depth of fans' investment in the setting. We care about Warhammer 40,000 enough to genuinely hate its villains, to feel anger at their successes and satisfaction at their failures. And Erebus embodies everything we despise about the universe, while serving as a perfect example of why that universe is so compelling. So here's to Erebus, the most hated character in Warhammer 40,000. May his name remain cursed throughout the grimdark future. May every new reader discover him and join the legion of fans who despise everything he represents. May his schemes continue to fail just enough to keep him from true victory, while succeeding enough to remain a threat and a source of frustration. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And at the heart of much of that war, at the root of so many betrayals and corruptions, stands one man in Word-bearer's armor, smiling his ruined smile as the galaxy burns around him. Fuck Erebus, now and forever. Ow, and yet the most hated character in Warhammer 40,000 has earned every bit of that hatred, and more. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the architect of the Horus Heresy, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that like button. There are so many more stories to tell from the grim darkness of the far future, so many more characters to examine and events to explore. Join us as we continue to uncover the secrets of Warhammer 40,000, one tale at a time. Until next time, remember, trust no one, question everything, and never, ever forgive Erebus.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.